Hello, everyone. I'm Najeeb Baqui, founder and managing director at Tinsley Park, an investment platform and an advisory firm. Welcome to another episode of Tinsley Park Talks, which is a global networking and leadership platform where we invite industry legends from finance to tech and policy experts to thinkers. In these digital interviews, we talk about all kinds of topics from finance to investing to entrepreneurship and all of the lessons of life. Today's episode is about the energy transition that's happening in the world. We'd like to call this episode Energy Addition instead of Energy Transition, and we'll tell you why. We have a very special guest today. He is none other than the Stephen Trauber, I like to call him. Stephen Trauber is currently the vice chairman and global head of natural resources and clean energy transition at Citigroup. Prior to Citigroup, he worked at UBS Investment Bank. He was the vice chairman and global head of energy there. And before that, he was with Credit Suisse First Boston. And he also worked at Morgan Stanley's energy group in Houston. Steve is involved in various charities and nonprofit organizations in Houston, including Rice University, Memorial Hermann. And he's also worked at over $600 billion worth of transactions in the sector of energy, broadly speaking. He's a graduate of Rice University undergrad and also an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management. It is my ultimate pleasure to invite Steve to the show today. Steve, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Najeeb. How are you?
I'm doing great. You know, we're both in Houston, so trying to just escape the heat last couple of days. It's been brutal, but yeah, and I know you're traveling too. So how's that been? Kind of going back.
I got away. You know, I was here this weekend. It was 100 degrees. I was looking at my iPhone. It said feels like 106, 108 with humidity. But I was able to get up to New York yesterday. It was beautiful up there. We actually got outside a little bit. And very nice up in New York. So at least there's some places in the country that aren't seeing the heat wave that we are down here in the Southwest.
I know it's expected though. It's expected, but
a little early in the year. We expected kind of late July, August, mid-June, early June is a bit early for this temperature, but we'll see.
That is so. We'll see. Well, thank you for joining me, Steve. I know you have a very busy schedule. You're flying out somewhere again soon. I heard. So, you know, maybe we start off by talking about yourself. Tell us about your upbringing a little bit and your journey through academics, early professional career, and how did you end up in investment banking?
Sure, happy to. Look, I grew up. My father worked for General Electric. My mother was an at-home mother, so she was able to stay at home and raise 5 kids. I'm one of 5 kids. I'm the oldest of 5 kids. But because my father's an immigrant from Israel, so he was and it will tie into some of the other things we talked about. But he was an Olympic swimmer in 1960. So wow. He came over, which is kind of what got me into sports later in life. But he worked for General Electric. We moved around a lot. So I was born in Connecticut, moved to the West Coast, California, both Northern and Southern California, upstate New York, Chicago, Connecticut, and back to Massachusetts before I ended up going to Rice University. I chose Rice because it was an opportunity to play Division I basketball as well as a very strong academic school. I liked Houston when I came to visit it. It was great. It was warm. It was kind of an interesting because I really narrowed my 2 choices down to Northwestern and Rice. And I mid-February I went to Northwestern to visit, and it was about 30 degrees and snow on the ground. It was freezing cold. Then the next week I came down to Houston. It was about 78 degrees, sunny. I said, "Wow, this is great." I'm 18 years old. I said, "I love this place." So I ended up choosing to come to Rice, and for me it was a great decision. I love Houston. I'm obviously back in Houston now, but it was a good decision for me. And you know, I actually started off as pre-med. Interesting enough, I wanted to be a doctor. I actually worked for Dr. Denton Cooley, who's one of the world-renowned heart surgeons. He used to be. I spent a summer working for him doing heart surgery. Actually, I was responsible for holding the heart while he worked. So I've held many hearts in my hands. But it was a great experience. But it did teach me I didn't want to be in medicine. It just was as tried as this may sound, it was very routine, doing the same thing every day, procedure after procedure. And I ultimately decided I wanted to go into finance. And so I ultimately actually started out of Rice, not knowing what I was going to do since I'd spent so much time thinking about medical school. I ended up joining Anderson Consulting, which is now Accenture, doing a lot of MIS consulting. And after 2 years, I went to Northwestern's business school, Kellogg Graduate School of Business. Decided I was going to do investment banking from there. And out of there, I joined what was called at the time the First Boston Corporation, now called Credit Suisse. And I spent the next 35 years doing investment banking in both Credit Suisse, Morgan Stanley, UBS, and Citi. So a combination of firms. Every move had its rhyme and reason. But it's been a great career. I've enjoyed it. Ultimately, early in my career, I decided to move out of New York, move back to Houston, because if you're going to do this job in this sort of environment, the long hours, the lots of travel, I wanted to have my wife in a place that she's comfortable with, her family, her friends. I didn't mention I married my wife. She's 2 years younger than me. When I got out of school, right before I went to business school, we got married. We have 3 kids and a foster son also that we have. And so it's been great. They're all out of the house now and productive, and it's been great.
Is your wife from the South?
She's a native Houstonian. She comes from immigrant parents too. Her parents were from Mexico. They came here when they're in their teens. They married, but she was born and raised in Houston, lived in Houston her entire life until I took her kicking and screaming to Chicago when I went to business school. That was a lot of fun. A person who's so used to the warmth and heat of Houston in the first winter in Chicago, I think every night her bags were packed. She was ready to go home, but each night I was able to talk her out of it. It was quite an experience for her.
I had another guest here at my podcast that went to Kellogg as well, and he's never been in a cold place like that before. So I asked him, like, how did you adjust to the winter? And similar answer, like to your wife's experience.
Tough. Fortunately, I lived in Chicago previously growing up. I lived in Boston and Connecticut, so I had some experience with cold weather. But it's interesting. You get acclimated to the environment you're in. I go up there now to recruit sometimes up at Kellogg, and in the wintertime, and I just don't know how I lived there for 2 years in the freezing cold. It is so cold up there in the winter. But people say similar things about Houston and the heat in the summertime.
Like we're talking about right now. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for that background, Steve. That's very helpful. Before we start talking about our topic today, which is energy transition, which you like to call energy transition. Energy addition. I just wanted to talk a little bit about your connection with basketball. And if you want to just share with the viewers your connection with basketball. You said you played in college, and then also how that sort of transcended into your next generation.
I've got a couple of unique stories on that. I was a basketball player at Rice. I loved basketball growing up. And I actually thought when I was in high school, I was actually going to graduate from school and become a college basketball coach. I quickly realized when I was in college that unless you're the elite 1 or 2 or 3, it doesn't pay real well, and you have to move around a lot, and job security is lacking. So I recognized real quick that I didn't want to do that, and I got into investment banking ultimately. But what it did allow me to do and think about once I had kids was getting into the ability to coach in my part-time. So I began coaching my kids when they were in elementary school and some of these youth leagues that they have. But ultimately, Houston has a number of good AAU teams, traveling teams, and I was able to coach all of my kids, my two sons and my daughter in those things. But my youngest son, we actually got very active at it. After I kind of had the trial and errors and tribulations of the first 2 kids, we got heavily involved in my youngest child, and we picked up a team. We put a lot of money into it. We actually got a number of my clients actually contributed to the team, because it was like a big thing in Houston. And we went out and recruited a number of kids from here, and we stayed with them from 3rd grade. My son was the only white kid on the team. We had these all-star kids from the city of Houston. It was fantastic, 4 of which are today in the NBA. But I stayed with them from 3rd grade all the way through high school. And it was great. We traveled the country. We traveled the world. We played in the World Championships in Italy when they were in 8th grade. And it was a lot of fun. It was absolutely fantastic. I still get Father's Day, having just gone past Father's Day. I get Father's Day cards from these kids. One of them Justice Winslow became my wife and my godson. He's actually staying at our house now. He's training down here. He plays for the Portland Trailblazers now. But It's great to see these guys go on. Every one of them went to college. Every one of them played sports in college. They all played basketball in college, except for all Division I basketball, interestingly enough, except for one who went to play LSU football. So it was a team of great kids. We did a lot of fun things along the way. We did a lot of cultural things. We focused on academics as well, by the way. If you didn't keep your grades up, you didn't play. So we tried to do it the right way. And I think in the long term, it's paid off for these kids. We still stay in touch with a lot of these kids and their parents. Along the way, though, the other side of the story is my oldest son who played. We met a young man by the name of Augustine Rubit, who's now a professional player in Europe. And he was living with a foster mom. His mother, unfortunately, was in jail. His father was deported to Colombia when he was 3 months old, so never knew his father. And what ultimately became the basketball version of The Blind Side, which is he was playing with my son's team. He kept coming over to the house. We got to know him. We saw the conditions he was living in. We found out the school he was going to. There was no male role model in his life whatsoever. And he was living with a foster mom who really was taking him in for the government money that she was able to get from it, but really wasn't taking care of him in the truest sense. And so when we learned about this, we took him into our house. We got him the right education in high school. He didn't know about going to college. He didn't know he was, he's a 6'8" African-American kid, a phenomenal basketball player whose grades hadn't been kept up because candidly, when he was in school, in a high school here in Houston, unfortunately, which is now shut down because of the quality of education they were providing, he'd show up for class and they'd just send him to the gym. They'd sign him in and send him to the gym. They were just passing him through the system. But when we got that, we changed that. We got him out of that school into another school. We got him tutors. Long story short, we were able to get him a scholarship to play at University of South Alabama, where he was an honorable mention All-American. He tried out for the Rockets when he graduated. He got his degree, first person in his family ever to get his college degree.
Wow.
And then not having made the Rockets, he went on to play professionally for the last 8 years in Europe. He's done phenomenally well, plays for Munich right now. Just finished up his season actually this week. He's coming home. And, it's been great because we have learned a lot by being associated with him. He married his college sweetheart, who was also a basketball player at South Alabama. They've had 3 kids. They've blessed us with 3 grandkids. And it's been fun. It's been great. I think, while he's thankful that we were able to get to him, he lived in a very poor, very bad part of town. He was highly likely to be a statistic ultimately, either incarcerated or killed potentially. We were able to get him out of that situation, and it's been great for our family. It's been great for him, and it's just it's one of those things that fate brought us together, and fate has kept us together.
That's an incredible story, Steve. Did you say that there was a program on ESPN that highlighted this story?
No, there were 2 articles. There's a magazine or an online rag that's called Shadow League. And if you go into Shadow League and / Augustine Rubit, there's a 4-part story that chronicles his life, including what happened before we were in his life and what's happened since. And then also ESPN.com / Augustine Rubit, you get another story that was written by ESPN, and they chronicle his life as well. And it's an amazing story because when the authors of those articles did those and we read them for the first time, I mean, both my wife and I were brought to tears. We didn't know, he never communicated some of the things that he had communicated with these authors about his life growing up and having to avoid the gangs and being pulled into gangs and having in one article, I'd be real brief, but in one article, a gang had gotten him. He'd been pulled into this gang, and somebody the first day in the gang, they gave him this bag of drugs to take it to someplace across town and drop it off. Anyway, he had gotten mugged on the way. Somebody knew he had it, stolen drugs. He comes back 11 years old, and he gets a gun. He gets a gun cocked to his head, and he says, "This is your first time. Next time the gun's going off." And you can imagine an 11-year-old just shaking in your pants. And I mean, so he tried. He grew. He was big, and he had to run from these gangs all the time just to stay out of them. It was, it's not an uncommon story in the in the middle of our city.
No, it's not.
Right, and it's like I said, it was fate that we came together. He's got an unbelievable heart. He's very smart. He's an unbelievable father of 3 great kids. I mean, I'm just so happy for him that that we came into his life, and candidly, he's graced us with so much, me and my kids and my wife, that it's been phenomenal. So
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing the personal side of your life. I'm sure a lot of folks didn't know that side of you. So thank you for that, Steve. So if you can jump into our topic today, what is energy addition?
It's actually it's kind of interesting. A lot of people like to write about energy transition, and I got on LinkedIn one time, and I don't know what made me just start writing, and I said, look, this is not about energy transition. We're not transitioning from anything. What we're trying to do is add more energy to the world. We need more energy. You can see where prices are today. The reason we have high oil prices and high gas prices is, candidly, we have a very tight supply-demand fundamental going on. We need more energy. And if we're going to grow all of our global economies to where we want to grow and global economies prosper, particularly 80% of the world, 80+% of the world that live in impoverished conditions. And we want to bring them up, and we want to raise their standard of living, all of which requires more energy. And our world is becoming more energy intensive. You think about everything you do, from your cars to phones, from the clothes you wear, everything you do requires some element and an increasing amount of energy. So this world needs more energy, and it's not going to be all supplied by hydrocarbons. So we're really talking about energy addition, not energy transition. We're not running away from hydrocarbons, nor should we run away from hydrocarbons. We need more hydrocarbons, not less hydrocarbons. But what we do need to do in the oil and gas business, in the business I worked in for the last 35 years, is to clean up our act. We do need to reduce carbon emissions. We need to reduce methane emissions, all greenhouse gases. We need to make sure we're doing a better job in that regard. And I do think that what has come out of this entire global movement has been an awakening of the oil and gas industry that we can do better. We need to do better. We have to do better, or we're going to be out of business. We're not going to get funded by our equity holders. We're not going to be funded by banks. And so we have to do better. And I do think that that's ongoing. There are technologies like carbon capture that are going to allow even emitters to be able to bring that CO2 back in and sequester it. So I do think that we need to do a better job. We are going to do a better job, but we need more hydrocarbons, and we need more other forms of energy. And so that's what energy addition is all about. And I think we'd all agree we want to live in a cleaner environment, but we also want to continue to grow as society. We want to grow all aspects of society, and we want to bring those countries that have poor conditions, poor living conditions, up out of that, and bring them into, candidly, the 21st century, and give them the opportunity to prosper as well. And that's going to take a lot of energy, and hopefully affordable energy on a global basis.
Well said, Mr. Trauber. Do you think the recent hike in price in oil and gas will push us back a little bit from the addition that we started to accelerate globally?
I actually think it's going to move us faster. And the reason I say that is I think people recognize we need more energy. That's the reason, like I said, the reason energy prices are so high is because we're short natural gas on a global basis, some of which has to do, candidly, with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine and the European Union backing out natural gas, and how Germany got so dependent on Russian gas. I can understand the thought process that went along the way. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with the thought process, but we are where we are, and now there's sanctions on gas coming out of Russia, and the European Union is short natural gas, and commodity prices are high. But that's only part of the story. This was well on its way pre-COVID because of the disinvestment in hydrocarbons.
Right, absolutely.
Around the world, including a lot of them here in the U.S., were not spending as much on hydrocarbons to continue to grow their reserves. And we have plenty of natural gas around the world. We just need to continue to invest in those, and we need an investing public to recognize that we need to do it. Like I said, we need to do it in a cleaner way, but we need to continue to provide natural gas and oil to the world. So I actually think the higher prices, right, provides a much higher umbrella for some of these other technologies to come in. I know we're going to talk about hydrogen in a little bit. Hydrogen is very expensive, right? Renewable energy.
Let's talk about that. Let's
right?
jump into the hydrogen topic. So, if you I'm sure you can talk about the policy, the policy, current policy versus what policy we could potentially have. So if we talk about hydrogen, let's try to see what the Biden administration's policy has done with the infrastructure bill to push forward with the hydrogen initiative. And if we looked at what Europe had done with their hydrogen policy, how would you contrast that, and how would you advise the administration to position ourselves to be
Well,
advantageous?
look, I probably wouldn't advise this administration on anything because I'm sure my humble opinion, wouldn't get it quite right. But look, I do think the European Union is working in a collaborative way, both the public and the private sides. It came out in 2020 with a hydrogen policy, right? And where they bring all of it together, and they look at investment together, and they have goals to achieve by 2024 and 2030 with regards to the amount of hydrogen, clean hydrogen, that will be delivered. I think it's 1 million metric tons in 2024, growing to 10 million metric tons by 2030, and they're working to grow that. Where you contrast that with the U.S., there isn't policy, right? And we shouldn't expect there to be policy. I mean, candidly, the U.S. has never really had an energy policy, right? Either. The U.S. and maybe that's better. The U.S. tends to let the private sector and companies actually drive, in a capitalistic society, supply and demand, and pushing that. The problem with it today is that hydrogen is expensive. Hydrogen is without incentives, doesn't make economic sense. There are a lot of companies that are pushing it, and I think with scale, as you work down the cost curves and improve the technologies and continue to grow and scale, those cost curves, those economic fundamentals will come down, and they'll become much more favorable. It's not dissimilar to where we were 15 years ago with renewable energy, wind and solar. But what made wind and solar possible back then, and what allowed us to get to a point today where it's actually very competitive with hydrocarbons, where there were incentives back then. There were government incentives to continue to grow renewable energy. We need more of that. If we want to drive more of something, regardless of what it is, we need incentives. That's just the reality. Our administration right now wants to punish the oil and gas industry. That's not going to drive more oil and gas. That's not going to drive more energy for the world. And what that's going to do is drive prices up. And if you pick up any newspaper today, listen to any news station, it doesn't matter which you're leaning left or right is, they're all going to talk about high gas prices. And why do we have high gas prices? Well, because there's penalties. So now what the administration is going to do is give us a tax holiday on gas. But what we really need is to promote and to find incentives for more production to be had here in the U.S. It's not dissimilar to our hydrogen. We need incentives, right? Incentives will drive capital to those businesses. Will pull more entrepreneurs and more businesses into working on technologies that can work down the cost curve and improve technology. And over time, my expectation is with scale and with the two things I just talked about, we'll get to a point where hydrogen is very competitive. And hydrogen is a great source of energy, a great storage of energy, and should be a key attribute, a key addition when we talk about energy addition.
Correct. I agreed. Where do you see the U.S. getting into the mining of lithium? Currently, we have China leading the way, and we're in a disadvantageous position when it comes to lithium. What's your view on that?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt, it seems to be, that lithium is going to be in very high demand as electric vehicles and other energy storage batteries continue to grow, proliferate on a global basis. Today, as you mentioned, China is the leading producer. Latin America, particularly Chile and Argentina, and Australia are the other major producers. Today in the U.S., we have one active mine in Nevada generating lithium. There are other states that have it, right? And so the key is not, as we've learned through the last 12 months or so, and through COVID and ultimately through the invasion of Ukraine, we need to have local supply chains. We can't completely rely on global supply chains. If we are going to be dependent on lithium, if we're going to be dependent on batteries and energy storage, we're going to need a secure supply chain of lithium, right? And I wouldn't want to bet that we're going to be able to get it necessarily from China for the long term. Now, Latin America, it may be a little bit safer, but it's certainly, you certainly want to forge relationships and partnerships with those countries. Maybe it's Australia, where the U.S. can secure an adequate supply and a growing supply of lithium. But we do also have lithium here in the U.S., right? We do have the mine. We have other states that have lithium. They just need to be mined. North Carolina, others, California, other mines. We also have these big geothermal brine, where you got lakes and ponds where people are actually trying to take this brine water, brine fluids, and process it for lithium. And we have the capability to do that. It's a new technology, lithium extraction. And as these technologies continue to develop, we may be able to develop lithium in other ways. And there are some people that believe that we have ample supplies here in the U.S. We just have to develop the methodologies, the technologies, and ultimately the mines to be able to supply that. So that, combined with relationships with some of our allies, should help supply that. No different than when the U.S. was very mature on oil, and we had to forge relationships to get oil supplies to the U.S., heavily reliant on the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, et cetera. We're going to have to do that in lithium. But I'd also say, though, is we can't necessarily just count on lithium. You talk about lithium. That's only one mineral. We're talking about cobalt, nickel, iron, palladium. Yeah. There's a lot, there's about 12 or 13 different supply chains we have to rely on to get to these batteries. Everybody wants to talk about the battery and energy storage. We're going to have to find a way in the U.S., candidly, all countries are, to ensure that they're going to have adequate supplies of all of these things, many of them which are mined in countries that none of us necessarily want to live and that have their own ESG related issues. So we're going to have to get comfortable with that as well. Whether it be slave labor, child labor, whatever it is, we have to be comfortable that where these supply chains are originating from and how they're getting to us, we're going to be able to count on those. Otherwise, we're going to have to develop different forms of batteries, different forms of energy storage, which is actually in the works as well, whether it be silicone or other things. There are other ways to develop batteries, other technologies. So I think it's a combination of all of this. The good news is that there's lots of investments being made in this area. There's lots of attraction of capital. People recognize the demand for this is going to be large, so that's attracting a lot of capital. So we're going to have to continue to find ways and secure those supply chains and ultimately find the technologies that we can count on.
Steve, where do you think most of the innovation is happening in battery storage? Is it in the U.S.? Is it in Europe?
I think it's a combination of both, candidly. I wouldn't eliminate there's some going on in Asia as well. Obviously, China. I know China, Korea, other places, I'm sure. There's a lot of it going on in the U.S. We have worked with a number of companies that are in the battery technology business to raise capital for them here in the U.S. And there's great demand for it. A lot of people are getting very comfortable with the various technologies. And today they're candidly betting more on the management team's ability to execute on those technologies. So there's a tremendous amount that's already, some have gone public, a lot of companies that are still young and developing their technologies and scaling up here in the US, but they're also both in Europe and in Asia as well.
Got it. Speaking of battery storage in America, we've seen an explosive growth in the number of battery storage facilities. Companies have started and just different projects all over the place. Tesla's doing it. We know some local players here as well in Texas. But you tend to see on one hand, you see all these battery storage projects going in line, and there's this tremendous amount of anticipated growth coming from the battery storage companies. And then you look at the ones that have a dozen or so of the companies that have been trading publicly are not quite reflecting the price in present value terms of this explosive future growth that just seems inevitable from a macro standpoint. Thoughts on that and where the disconnect is? Look,
I would say if you roll back the clock 12, 18 months ago, there was huge valuations that were being paid for energy storage, for battery technologies, et cetera, because of what you mentioned, the explosive growth expected in demand for batteries of all sizes, both industrial, EV, et cetera. Clearly, the market has cooled substantially with regards to growth-oriented stocks. We're facing potential recessions. We have supply chain issues. We have differing technologies. A lot of technologies have been rolling out. And so today, the market has backed off a lot of growth-oriented sectors, including technology, including energy transition or addition, including battery storage, as you mentioned. So I'm not sure that the public companies necessarily reflect the growth in what is expected to be in the demand, and if they were to lay out their 5-year forecast or 10-year forecast, and you did a typical discounted cash flow analysis, whether today's valuation would come in substantially below what they believe. But what people are doing is discounting a number of things, right? They're discounting candidly some of the supply chain issues we talked about, and how fast are they going to be able to get it. They're discounting the technology. I mean, I think
technology risk, right?
There's technology risk in all of these, right? They're discounting the competitive tension that there's a lot of these companies that are out there who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers. And so people are trying to figure that out. I mentioned that a lot of people are banking on the management teams who have the expertise internally, who knows how to run a public company, who knows how to meet quarter-to-quarter projections. And a lot of these companies came out of the box quickly. They had very strong projections and they didn't meet them for a variety of reasons. And when you don't meet your projections, when you're an early, young public company, investors run away and they rarely come back. And so that's what's being reflected in the public companies today. We are seeing relatively robust valuations, though, being applied to private companies, where investors get very comfortable with both the technology and the management teams. And today, when we just recently sold 2 different businesses in the battery technology business, and when you look at the valuations we were able to get for these companies, it kind of implies about an 8 to 12%, depending upon some of your inputs, of returns, which is candidly, given the risk we just talked about, pretty attractive valuation, pretty high valuations. And so I think people do buy
these private transactions. Were these private equity transactions, or
yeah, these were companies that were bought actually by private equity. Yeah.
Okay, these were private companies, no investment before, and they bought them. Okay, at good multiple.
And they bought them at infinite multiples because they don't have any EBITDA today. They're developing, right? They've got projections, they've got the technology, they're scaling up their facilities. But when you do the math and you look at the projections and you figure out what the implied valuation is and what kind of returns that implies, somewhere between 8 to 12%, and that is very low returns for the risks that they're taking and all the things we've talked about. Right. So I think people are still buying. There's still a lot of hope. There's a lot of expectations that energy storage is going to be critical to our growth in energy needs, and that the batteries and battery storage, energy storage is going to be critical to all of that for all the reasons we also have talked about. So I do think there's a lot of demand. I can tell you there's a lot of demand both on the venture capital side and the private equity side. And for those companies who ultimately develop, there will be a lot of demand in the public equity market for the winners as well.
Makes sense. Thank you. I think we're almost nearing the conclusion here. Before I ask you the last question, let me just ask you broadly from a macro standpoint. I mean, all this noise going on in the economy, inflation's crazy. The markets are tanking. There's Fed can't do anything else with they run out of their toolkit. And we're, it's a really dire environment out there, psychologically, economically, financially. What's your view, briefly? Like, are we going to be okay? How long?
First of all, we absolutely are going to be okay. Look, the U.S., first of all, is the most really resilient, strong, and great country in the world. The global economy has always been resilient. We are going to be fine. Doesn't mean that we're not going to see more downside from here. The Fed is, as you've seen, recently raised rates by 75 basis points. They're talking about, if needed, they'll look to raise them again, trying to avoid a recession, right? We look at it as kind of the 3 R's, right? You got rising rates, you got recessionary fears, and you got Russia. And all 3 of these things play a big key in the overall economy, right? When there is uncertainty out there, and there is clearly uncertainty now, how high do rates go? Are we having a recession, right? And what is the end game in Russia, Ukraine? When there is that sort of risk in the marketplace, people back off on the risk. They pull money out of the market. They try to look for safe havens, right? And so that's what we're seeing right now. And I think it's going to take some time. I mean, there's a lot of different economists, a lot of different banks like Citi that are projecting that, that we are going to go into a recession. The question is the end of this year? Is it early next year? But the ride between here and coming out of recession is always a little bumpy. But I would absolutely say that we're going to be just fine. Our 401ks may be a little lower. Things may cost a little bit more. Obviously at the gas tanks are costing more. Our heating oil is going to cost more. Our food is going to cost more. We're seeing a lot of inflationary pressures, but we're going to be fine and we'll come out of it. And look, we're seeing the government try to do the things they can to, land us softly here in the economy. And, they have a history of, sometimes overshooting, but we end up getting there. It's just a matter of time. So
Okay.
caution everybody to be patient and not do anything crazy and just hopefully, be smart in your investment decisions and think about putting a little money away just to keep.
Awesome. Well, there you go. Straight from the source, Mr. Trauber. Before I let you go here, what career advice do you have for young professionals that are trying to enter in the world of investment banking?
Look, I'll tell you what I tell people when I go on campus all the time. And it's one of the first things I typically say. I said, look, investment banking is not for everybody. It's extraordinarily hard. There are very long hours in the job. We're working on many different things at one time. We're serving the C-suite of most companies that are very demanding. Usually the things we're working on are the most important things going on at these companies at the time. We are in the service business, which means everything has to happen now. So, there's a lot of stress, a lot of time pressures. And so unless you're really prepared to work extraordinarily hard, this is not for you, which is fine. Every job, I would argue, you have to work hard if you're going to be successful at it. Right. This one just has a lot of pressures and a lot of hard work. I mean, we investment bankers, particularly the young ones, are well known for working 80, 100+ hour weeks. Right. But what I would also say, in my humble opinion, is that there's no better job to take coming out of school. I tell everybody on campus, if you can just think about the next 2 to 3 years of your career is just another building block on top of your education, on top of the experiences you've had up to graduation. The next 2 to 3 years are just going to be a lot of experiences. You're going to work on multiple transactions at one time. They're going to turn over quickly. Over a 2 to 3 year period, you're going to work on 50+, 100 type of number of transactions. You're going to be talking to CEOs. You're going to be in the midst of a lot of things. You're going to be working with very smart people, and you're going to learn a whole lot. And whether you want to be an investment banker your whole career like I've been, or whether you want to go off into private equity, the corporate world, or something else, what you're going to learn in the 2 to 3 years that you're come out of school and get into investment banking is going to be second to none. No other career can prepare you like this does. And there's one thing. I've been doing this 35 years, so I've got hundreds of young folks who have worked with me in the past. And there's one common theme that I always hear from them, and I kind of chuckle now when they tell me. They always say, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. There were lots of days I wanted to quit. But if I did it over again, I'd do the same exact thing because it's what got me to where I am. And these are CEOs of companies now, people at very highest levels of private equity. They're doing great things in society, in the corporate world, and they attribute it to what they learned in the 2 to 3 years that they served as an investment banker. And some stay on as investment banking. So it's a great career. The advice is do well in school, right? Think about why you want to think about the why. Why do you want to be an investment banker? Don't think about it as I'm going to make good money. I'm going to meet really interesting people. Think about it as I'm going to learn a lot, and it's going to prepare me for whatever I do in the future. And do your homework. And think about every company you go interview. Why do you want to do it? What makes your skill base and who you are the appropriate person for that job, and convey that. Relax in the interviews and convey that. Be yourself, and things will work out.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your time today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure we're going to talk very soon again.
Well, it's very nice to have been here. I appreciate you chatting with me, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.